Hi, I'm Woody and welcome to Woody Minis. Today we're going to find out what happens when you smash together Sigmar's finest and the Emperor's finest. I'm solely a 40k collector and I collect Custodes, but there's one thing I've noticed with the range is that there's far too many golden bananas standing around holding an axe. When I look at the Age of Sigmar range, I see models with dynamism, with character, in the process of doing some cool things, whether it's tearing up monsters, charging into battle, or preparing to slay a tyrant. I want the best of both, so I'm going to smash together the most dynamic Age of Sigmar Stormcast Eternal minis, the Blacktalons, with the Adeptus Custodes Sagittarum Guards squad.
The first step was picking which one to go first, and this was Oxenhammer. He's the guy with the big hammer, of course. I assembled all of them with blue tack first, and then started disassembling them to find out which places I could stick on Custodian bits and pieces. The obvious Sigmar pieces were the first bits to go, such as these little purity seal things with Sigmar runes on. Next up on the chopping block were these Phi Guards. I had to take apart the model a bit more first to be able to get a good angle to chop them off, but once I did, it was pretty easy and it just took a couple of snips. These are going to be replaced with the Custodian Phi Guards, which have a bit more detail on them. This part was a bit trickier because cutting off this Phi Guard left the torso and the leg completely separate. Afterwards, it was time to just remove more details from the torso. With this clipping done, it was time to test the Sagittarum arms on the model. They fit quite well with the blue tack, and once they were on, the gun was an easy fit too. He was starting to look a lot more 40k than Age of Sigmar. After fiddling around with him for a bit, the pose was looking like I wanted, and I could start adding on the shoulder parts. This one is from the Custodian Guard Aquilon Terminators, and the one on the right is just from a normal Custodian Guard or Warden squad. I was starting to really like the pose of him aiming his sights down the gun, but when I looked at it from another angle, it wasn't quite looking quite right with the way his feet were pointing forwards. So this would get changed at a later date. It's now time to hide that big gap on his thigh with the Custodian Guard armor pieces. It just took a bit of pushing and pulling to get it in the right spot where we couldn't see the gap anymore. The other side was a bit easier, there were no big holes to cover up, so it was just a simple push and fit, and I was quite happy with it. Once the bulk of the model was assembled, I noticed that the back was looking a little bit bare, so I had to look in my bits box to find some Custodian pieces that I thought would fit well. After trying on the Vexilla and the Aquilon Terminator shoulder pads, I settled on this, an Alarus Terminator hood. It needed a bit of cutting and tidying up, so I removed the two prongs and the eagle's head. After that, it was just a simple stick on the back, and the first build was assembled in blue tack. I then glued together all the pieces that were push fit and started to work on filling in some gaps with some AB putty, the biggest of which was the gap where the neck joint should be. I also added putty to the shoulder joints to make assembling the arms a bit easier, giving me a bit more leeway to play around with it. This putty begins to harden in about 30 minutes, but it's also quite solid just for holding things in place. So sticking on the arms again was no problem, and I got it into a pose that I liked a little bit more than the aim down the barrel kind of one. I instead opted to have him look like he was holding his weapon up to attention, striding through a hail of gunfire towards enemy lines, shrugging off every shot they had to offer. The putty was starting to look a bit messy, so I went in with a silicone tip sculpting tool to just clean up any of the joints. This would also allow a better fit for the shoulder guards. Once they were stuck on, the model was looking a lot cleaner and you could hardly see some of the putty. I then started cleaning up the neck joint so that I could attach the head and call this model done. Once all the putty had hardened, this is the sculpt that I was left with. He's looking cool, striding forward into battle, big beefy shoulder pads. He's got that Aquilon Terminator bulk that I really like from the Custodes range. And with Oxenhammer converted, it was time to move on to the next model. It's Hendrik the Silver Wolf, a veteran of many campaigns. I started with the same process as for Oxenhammer by clipping away those Phi Guards, as well as any extra details that I could find. For this one though, I couldn't really replace the arms, so I had to get a little bit more creative with the clipping of all these shoulder joints. Another issue is that I wanted to keep the arms and the weapons were already attached to them, so I had to carefully trim off his axe, and I decided to leave on his sword because it just looked really cool. The shoulder joints were very tricky though. I noticed that his sword and his scabbard in the back was directly blocking it, so this would also have to go. After pulling apart his cape and pulling apart the rest of the body, it was time to start clipping. I couldn't just remove the scabbard and the sword hilt, I had to actually dig apart part of the cloak as well, which I knew would be a pain in the butt when it came to making the model cohesive, and the need for using green stuff sculpting later, which is my weakest part of mini building. Once I'd attached the shoulder guard, I realised that the scabbard was huge and there was no way I could get rid of it. I'd have to cover the whole thing in green stuff, as well as fill in that huge gap by his shoulder pad. But before I could even think about doing that, it was time to do the other side. I ended up pulling apart the whole model just to get a good angle to cut off this part of the front cloak. A couple quick snips and a search for spare parts later, it was time to reassemble the whole model so I could attach the left shoulder joint and begin working on where to place his bolt caliber gun. I'd already decided to have his right arm resting on the gun as if he's waiting, surveying a battlefield, and to do that I needed to cut off the hands, the fingers, the trigger guard and everything else you could see, so it was just a pure naked gun at rest. A bit of trimming and some shaving with my little hobby knife, and I got the gun looking in a decent way that I wanted. I just had to be quite careful and took a bit of a shortcut by using some clippers for his hand here too. I carefully made some cuts, and then a twist later it was gone, but this left me without a trigger guard, so I had to find one, and find one I did on the Custodian Guard spear kit. I held on to the tip to stop it pinging off and losing it, and then clipped it open and was ready to superglue it onto the missing part of the gun. Although it is missing a trigger and trigger guard, the handle makes it look quite nice, and I imagine in the future in 40k the Custodians might not need a conventional trigger, so a little button on the side might just suit fine. The other tricky part was how to get it in position without it looking a bit silly. Of course I didn't want the barrel facing down into the dirt, and I also didn't want his hand over the top of the barrel, so of course the smart thing to do was put it on top of the Adraphic Destructor, a pretty capable weapon from the Dark Age of technology, but I figure as a Custodian, this guy might just be able to shrug it off. There was no hole in the neck to fill in, so I was able to stick on the head before prematurely calling this model finished and realising I had a whole cloak to fix with green stuff, which I was really not looking forward to. I stuck on a ball of putty and using a fine-tipped metal sculpting tool began pressing it into shape over the shoulder joints where the gap was. I then added more over the whole of the cloak and began smoothing it down before gently pushing and prodding small triangles in to create the illusion of fur. It took a fair while, but my goodness, it was worth it. Even worth the carpal tunnel at the end of it. But I was very happy with the end result, and after a few details to tidy up at the bottom, I was feeling very proud about this mini. It was also about this time that I realised I wouldn't have time to finish the whole squad before going on vacation, so I decided that instead of letting these two sit around, I'd get painting them almost immediately. I base coated white and then added skeleton horde contrast paint to the horns, followed by a mix of Guilliman flesh and skeleton horde to the armour, before adding a little marble effect by gently moving away. The details were painted with Balthazar gold to give it a bit more of a contrast. The leather was painted with wildwood bark, eyes were white filled with contrast green, and the weapon effects were done the same way too. I then covered up all of the gold with Null Oil to give it a bit more depth and a bit of a grittier look, before sticking on some overgrowth. The overgrowth was just PVA covered with green flock or grass tufts used for basing. I then added a splash of Baltan green shade to help it blend in better with the rest of the model. Once I'd done that, I started working on the next model. For his cloak, which I'd start with first, I base coated with Bugman's Brown. Then I followed it up with a wash of Wildwood, followed by a dry brush of Wraithbone. This helped it stand out and you could see all the individual hairs. For the inside, I base coated Wraithbone, then Guilliman flesh, just to give it that leather look. I repeated the same process as the previous model with the armor, Guilliman flesh and contrast, followed by Balthazar gold for the details. I then added the green eyes and the glowing green to the sword and the weapons. For the gems I needed something different. I base coated black, followed by a crescent of white at the bottom and a dot of white at the top. I then added contrast green to the bottom, overlapping the white and the grey to give it a reflection. I then added some slightly dry, glowing fluorescent green to the weapons, the eyes and the blade to make it really pop, followed by the usual Nuln oil treatment for the golds. Then it was the same step with overgrowth, dabs of PVA over parts of the model, followed by green grass flock and then Biltang green. After some quick basing, they were done.
And with that, the first 2 minis are complete. I still have 3 more to go, but I'm off on vacation for the next 2 weeks. Hit like and hit subscribe, and the next 3 minis will be released as soon as I get back from vacation. Thank you and goodbye.